John 14:15 says, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." Before we discuss the meaning of this verse, we need to first find out what his commandments are. Most people assume that he's talking about the 10 Commandments, and they say that we must keep the 10 Commandments to be saved, even though it's a contradiction to the rest of Scripture and makes the gospel of no effect. But thankfully you will see that the Bible does not want us to be ignorant about which commandments Jesus is speaking about here. If you do a word search in the New Testament for the word commandments and look for all the places that Jesus spoke of them, you'll find that he did indeed refer to the 10 Commandments and to the commandments of God several times. But he referred to them every time as either the Father's commandments or the law's commandments or the commandments. He never refers to any of them as his commandments. Now, to be sure, I think that Jesus was God himself and that his commandments are the 10 Commandments. But when Jesus was on earth, he did not speak of the 10 Commandments as his. What we just read about Jesus talking about his commandments was said at the Last Supper. Now, just before that, at the same Last Supper, just after Judas left the room to go betray Jesus, Jesus had told them what his commandment was. John 13:34 and 35 says, "A new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another as I have loved you, that ye also love one another. By this all men know that ye are my disciples, if ye have love one to another." So, when Jesus talks about his commandment a few minutes later, it's clear that he's referring to this commandment. I can't even begin to tell you the importance of this verse to the apostles. And this is going to be referred to again and again all throughout the New Testament. Two things to notice about this new commandment that Jesus himself gives. Number one, it's about loving your brother, that is, loving one another, and it is specifically his commandment that he gives. Number two, it is by this specifically that people will know if we are truly his disciples. Now that is going to be very important. Jesus does not ever give any other signs of evidence of salvation except this one thing, if you love one another. So as we look at references to this commandment in the New Testament, notice the connection it has with this evidence of salvation. John the Apostle, many years after he wrote the Gospel of John, wrote some letters, and they're also in the Bible. And it's fair to say that the singular focus of his letters is this new commandment about brotherly love given by Jesus. He refers to it over and over. 1 John 2 verse 3 says, "And hereby we do know that we know him, if we keep his commandments." And again, notice that when talking about his, as in Jesus' commandment, it is always tied to the evidence or proof of our discipleship. John does not leave us guessing as to what this commandment is specifically. 1 John 3:23 and 24, "And this is his commandment, that we should believe on the name of his Son Jesus Christ, and love one another as he gave us commandment. And he that keepeth his commandments dwelleth in him, and he in him. And hereby," listen to this, "and hereby we know that he abideth in us by the Spirit which he hath given us." John also here mentions the second commandment that Jesus gave at the Last Supper. There are two commandments. John here said that the other was to believe in him. Let's review what Jesus said at that Last Supper from the time that Judas left until the first time he says, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments," to see if he gives these two commandments that John says he did. The first one we already know, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another." But then he says this, "Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me." Jesus said to him, "Have I been with you so long, and yet you have not known me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father, so how can you say, 'Show us the Father'? Do you not believe that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me? The words that I speak to you I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does the works. Believe me that I am in the Father, and the Father in me, or else believe me for the sake of the works themselves. Most assuredly I say to you, he who believes in me, the works that I do, he will do also." And then he says, "If you love me, keep my commandments." John is the only gospel that tells us about this conversation at the Last Supper, which is the only place, besides the letters of John, that this phrase occurs. That is, Jesus talking about his personal commandments about loving one another and believing in him. I want to read a few more verses from 1 John because I want you to be really sure about this. Especially notice that this new commandment, the one that Jesus called his, about loving one another, is the one that was always tied to the evidence of salvation, which is consistent because Jesus says, this is how people are going to know if you're my disciples. 1 John 3:14 says, we know that we have passed from death to life. Okay, so he's talking about salvation. This is how we know that we have been saved, because we love the brethren. He that loveth not his brother abideth in death. Do you see the pattern yet? This loving your brother thing, this new commandment, Jesus' specific commandment, is the very evidence a believer has of salvation. What about 1 John 4:12 and 13? It says, no man hath seen God at any time. If we love one another, God dwelleth in us, and his love is perfected in us. Hereby know we that we dwell in him, and he in us, because he hath given us of his Spirit. I hope you're starting to get the picture. When Jesus refers back to the new commandment that he gave them and says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments, he's saying that it is the proof that the Spirit is in you. It will begin to bear fruit. A legalist looks at this verse the exact opposite. They say keeping the commandment is not the evidence of salvation, it is the requirement of salvation. I hope you see the very important difference there. Let's continue looking at these verses. As I said, the New Testament is very consistent on this. Let's finish up first with John. In his second letter, he says the following, and now I beseech thee, lady, not as though I wrote a new commandment unto thee, but that which we had from the beginning, that we love one another. And this is love, that we walk after his commandments. This is the commandment, that as ye have heard from the beginning, you should walk in it. For many deceivers are entered into the world, who confess not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh. This is a deceiver and an antichrist. So you see here again, he refers to this new commandment, Jesus' commandment, the one about loving one another, and it's directly connected to a conversation about who is and who isn't a real Christian. Galatians says something interesting when it says, bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. The law of Christ. That's interesting. There is a law that is Christ's law specifically, and Galatians says it is to bear one another's burdens. Now, the reason all these New Testament writers referred to it like this is that Jesus made it so clear. In fact, towards the end of that Last Supper, Christ reiterates again and defines what his commandment, this new commandment, is. In John 15:12 and 13 it says, this is my commandment, that ye love one another as I have loved you. Greater love hath no man than this, than a man lay down his life for his friends. The Apostle James, the brother of the Lord, refers to this commandment of Jesus as the royal law. He says in James 2, verse 8, if ye fulfill the royal law according to the Scripture, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, ye do well. And James also talks about this law in regard to the works that prove your faith. The consistency in this is overwhelming. And how many times have you heard the following verses and somebody was using it to tell you that salvation was by works? Perhaps now as we read these verses, you're going to hear James as he's meant to be heard. If ye fulfill the royal law according to the Scripture, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, ye do well. If a brother or sister be naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you say unto them, depart in peace, be ye warmed and filled, notwithstanding you give them not those things which are needful to the body, what doth it profit? Even so faith, if it hath not works, is dead, being alone. Yea, a man may say, thou hast faith, and I have works. Show me thy faith with thy works, and I will show you my faith by my works. James is saying, okay, you say you're a Christian, but we know about the royal law, so prove it. If you say that you have the love of Christ in your hearts, do we see any evidence of it in your loving one another? So again, remember Jesus' words in Matthew 26:28. For this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. When he was saying the New Testament, which literally means new covenant, he was not making something up. He is referencing the prophets who spoke of a coming king who would take upon him the sins of the world and be crushed by God's wrath so that God could forget the sins of his people and begin to indwell them and change them from the inside out. Jeremiah 31:34 says, No more shall every man teach his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, saith the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sins I will remember no more. So where does all this leave us? Do we even strive for holiness? Do we try to eradicate sin in our lives? How does this affect our earnest desire to live godly lives? Strive for holiness with all your heart. There's no reason why we shouldn't be diligent in eradicating sin. Think of yourself as kind of a sin assassin. All sins are leading to death. All sins are stealing joy and destroying your lives. We now have the power to resist them, so we definitely should. Thank the Lord for setting the bar so high with His life and His teachings, and let us strive to reach holiness. But if you stumble on the way, God is not mad at you. You have not lost your salvation. Don't listen to the devil, who is your accuser, and after you sin, he whispers in your ear, don't go to God. He's mad at you. It's a lie. Run to God. It's not like you can hide anything from Him anyway. He wants to hear from you about it. He wants to help you through it. He wants to help you learn from it. If nothing else, pray for more and more conviction of sin, so that your sin will become increasingly detestable to you. Thanks for your time.